Good afternoon and good morning to those of you attending the Asia Clean Energy Forum. I'd like to welcome you to session 4.3, and I want to make sure we have the view of me on the main slide. Okay, I'm just checking with my, okay, we're good now. So my name is Peter DuPont. I'm have been a past co-chair of Asia Clean Energy Forum for the past 16 years. I'm now a senior advisor, and I run a firm called Asia Clean Energy Partners, and we work with ADB to put on the Asia Clean Energy Forum. I'm excited to be here for session 4.3 on embedding climate resilience into financing. And so what does that mean? Okay, so we have a great panel who's going to share their experience, a range of experiences from different parts of Asia. And the questions we're going to address in broad measure are why resilience is important when you're financing energy infrastructure. What does it really mean to be resilient? What is a resilient project? What are the characteristics of it? Can you give some examples? And we're going to hear a number of different examples. We're going to examples of energy infrastructure investments in Southeast Asia that are resilient and that are not resilient. And if we don't get to the not resilient ones in the presentations, we'll get to that in the discussion, because I think it's really important to sort of compare and contrast. And finally, what is the role of business versus government in promoting and driving resilience into energy infrastructure investments? So again, we have a great panel here. We are starting off on greening corporate supply chains. We're going to go after that into hearing about a gender responsive renewable energy fund. Then we're going to hear about the role of fintech solutions in driving carbon neutrality in Indian MSMEs. And then we're going to bring in a couple of panelists with expertise in energy efficiency infrastructure, including street lighting, and also from the German government talking about resilience and development. So that's what we'll hear over the next 88 minutes or so. And with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker. It's a pair of speakers. We have Surbi Singhvi, who is with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Surbi is manager for energy transformation, and she will be co-presenting. She'll be presenting first with an old friend and colleague of mine, Dana Kenny, who is a project director for energy at Apt Associates. And Dana and I had the pleasure of working together on the USAID Clean Power Asia program, where she was stationed in Bangkok, where I lived for about 5 years or so. So good to see you, Dana, and good to see you, Surbi, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you're attending the Asia Clean Energy Forum from. It's a pleasure for my co-presenter, Dana Kenny, and myself to talk to you about greening corporate supply chains through renewable energy policy reforms in the next 10 minutes. The structure that we're going to take is in the first 5 minutes, I will explain the approach that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has taken and the impacts that we've had through that approach. And a similar line of thought would be then followed by Dana. Just quickly, for all of you to know a little bit about what and who WBCSD is. We're a global CEO-led organization of 200 forward-thinking businesses, and we work with these businesses to accelerate the system transformation. Our major support to these companies is on the how to. So we help them on how to decarbonize to become net zero, how to contribute to an inclusive and equitable society, and very importantly, also how to keep their businesses successful in an uncertain world. This is where it ties in with the resiliency factor that Peter talked about in the beginning. It's about supporting them on transparent internal and external reporting, making them aware of the risks that they face in the short, medium, and long term. And then also supporting them on making appropriate strategies to deal with them. So that's about making them resilient. And a very important part of this approach is that we work across the value chains. I'm going to quickly talk to all of you about two of our programs that are focused on scaling up renewable energy deployment. This one is a global one, and it's called Rescale. The name is self-explanatory. We are looking at overcoming barriers in corporate PPA adoption globally. And we do this by increasing our members, which are majorly companies and businesses across the globe, their understanding and use of corporate renewable PPAs. We decided to do some global topical deep dives, which were some of the common themes that companies were facing issues in with respect to adoption of corporate PPAs. And hence, we took deep dives into what multi-technology PPAs are, what cross-border PPAs are, how do you adopt them, how do you account for PPAs in your financial reporting, etc. And while we were doing this, we also realized that there are a few countries and the companies that we worked with in those countries realized that there is a lot of potential for renewable energy uptake in these countries, and it warranted a deep dive for those countries, looking at what are these explicit issues and challenges that these countries are facing. And hence, we did deep dives for India, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa. And where it ties with the policy work, which is the theme of this session today, we take the unified business voice, which is collective business voice to the government. That's a bottom-up approach that we do, which is taking businesses' inputs to the government, be it through public declarations in response to any policy or regulatory change, be it through letters to the national government suggesting policy and regulatory recommendations. But we also work on the top-down bit, which is looking at making the policies and regulatory understanding and simplifying the regulatory complexities wherever it exists within for the businesses. The impact for us has been very rewarding. We see that more than 50% of the global corporate PPA capacity that has been signed globally has been signed by WBCSD members. We've also seen much faster year-on-year increase in the renewable energy share by our Rescale members vis-a-vis the global average. A similar approach that we take is on energy storage, which is sort of a nascent technology still, and it looks at balancing the renewable energy in the grid plus giving opportunities for businesses to optimize renewable energy. We've put together a collaborative platform, and this is very Asia specific. We've done this in India. This collaborative platform has over 25 companies from across the value chain. You see all those companies here on the slide. The idea is to solve some of the challenges that each of these companies individually cannot solve, but these are the common problems that these companies face in deployment of energy storage. Hence, we've put together this platform and work with all of these companies. One of our aims is to foster new partnerships across the value chain to accelerate deployment. And we've been also the impact of this, while this is an ongoing project and this only started in June last year, we've also been very, very delighted to have a couple of companies form a joint venture to cater to the Indian energy storage market. We've also had a finance company provide a credit line to one of our members to provide energy storage solutions. Another area where it ties in with the policy bit is that we're working with all of these businesses to, because it's a nascent technology and a nascent market in India yet, we're taking these collective business inputs on policies to the government to support the business ambition in turn. So that's in a nutshell energy storage work in India. I now give the floor to Dana, who's going to talk about the work that APT has done. Over to you, Dana.
Thank you very much, Surbi. And at the end of the 5 years of implementing the USAID-funded Clean Power Asia program, the dollars we mobilized and megawatts of power that were financially closed exceeded the targets tenfold, and also the policies with associated projected CO2 emissions reductions were greater than expected. And the unprecedented success of the rooftop photovoltaics policy and regulatory support was really a main contributor. and it was driving the clean energy transition in Southeast Asia. With our partners, we worked with the policymakers across Southeast Asia in specific countries to address the implications and the impacts of rooftop PV policies and regulations. Now, we did work on other issues like storage in Thailand, but the most extensive work we did was on DPV, and it is one of the things that's the greatest contributor to climate resilience as well. So we looked at these implications and impacts for various stakeholders, including corporations, and public sector concerns included both climate mitigation and adaptation resilience goals. So those were important to the policymakers. Let's stay on this slide now. And I wanted to reiterate here that some details related to both Thailand and the Philippines. APT used data and analysis to dispel some myths that stoked some opposition to change in each of the countries. And this, in some ways, informed corporations and sometimes augmented other qualitative assessments. In Thailand, however, despite some of the changes made, the tariffs as of last year were still not high enough to induce selling to the grid much above companies' own needs, and has limited investment in rooftop PV. Whereas the policy and regulatory analyses and utility capacity building in the Philippines has helped double DPV investment as of last year. Next slide, please. The real success was in Vietnam. Now this work was led by the Vietnam Low Emission Energy Program, which is another USAID program. And our contribution from APT was a best practices report, as well as analysis of customer economics, which supplemented or complemented a corporate customer survey that Viet conducted. And those analyses led to major policy changes, which included allowing sales to the grid and to other customers, as well as a higher tariff that had an end date, which proved to be critical because it's what mainly led to the huge uptake over time during that year at such an accelerating rate. And corporate PPAs were essential to the success of these RE policy reforms in all the countries where without them, you wouldn't see that kind of impact. So thank you very much. We'll show the last slide with our smiling faces, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Serbi and Dana. I do have some questions. Normally in the physical event, I might clarify, but I think it's best we'll just move on. I do have an observation though before we begin with the next speaker, Surajit, and that's I'm probably going to come back to you, Dana, on the issue or the incentives for resilience on distributed energy and the policy barriers, for example, in Thailand related to feeding into the grid. And maybe you have some thoughts about, how those barriers could be turned around in the sense of providing incentives for overall resiliency. So you don't need to respond now, but we'll come back to that. And Serbi, thank you for sharing the great work on rescale and energy storage, and that will come up during the discussions, I'm sure. So next, I'd like to introduce Surajit Iyer, who is Vice President with Octus ESG. And he's going to talk about a really interesting fund that they're setting up. It's a gender-responsive fund focused on renewable energy in less developed countries. Focus is on Zimbabwe, but this could be a really inspiring example for not only other countries in Africa, but I assume in Asia as well. So Surajit, thank you for joining us, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Peter, and very good day to all colleagues. I am Surajit from Octus ESG. We are a sustainable finance, ESG, and climate risk advisory company working with various clients from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Next slide, please. So very quickly, let's move to the next slide, please. Yeah, okay, thanks. So let me share the context a bit. So Zimbabwe is not your regular developing country. It has problems that are manifold to a typical developing country, in fact. So from access to finance, access to energy, very low uptake of clean energy, economic mainstreaming of women is still low, etc., etc. So what happened here was that 3 UN agencies that are based in Zimbabwe, along with the government of Zimbabwe, the idea was to team up. They teamed up with a team of consultants, in which we were also one of them. And the purpose was to draft and put forward a blueprint proposal of a financing facility to the UN Joint SDG Fund. Now, our proposal pitched a structure of a renewable energy finance facility or fund, essentially using a blended approach, which would focus on women and youth-led clean energy businesses, where there is a productive end use, including decentralized renewable energy businesses that really touch the rural or the low-income communities, which this particular project wanted to benefit. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as per the proposal regarding the structure of the entire facility or the fund, what was finally decided was that the joint SDG fund would put in money as a source of public capital, and then this was used to approach and gain commitments from local commercial finance institutions. So namely led by Old Mutual, Zimnat Asset Management, and so on, ultimately investing equity in the private equity limited partner structure. It was felt in the discussions with the project stakeholders that this was more practical in Zimbabwe's context, given that some of these businesses may need some time, gestation, guidance to scale up. Co-investment approach would also then help in risk sharing, a key aspect. So this particular fund would be hosted by Old Mutual Group's Zimbabwe arm, who would be then the GP per se, and it would be a sub-fund under a renewable energy fund that they already have. The advantage of that was that would simplify the process of hosting the fund from a governance and legal entity perspective, which would also reduce the compliance cost. Now, these are also important considerations while looking at sustainable finance or sustainable finance for energy particularly. Credit line commitment was also taken from a local bank. So it was not just about equity, it was also about credit lines in case there were investees who would require debt lines. So from one of the leading local banks called CABS. So the idea, ultimately, what I want to stress on here for the benefit of the audience is that the idea was to keep the approach very flexible and take each proposal on the merit. And we find this a key learning for sustainable finance facilities. Keep it flexible, be open to alternate structures. It's not necessary that a square peg will always find a square hole. So the purpose is to make that peg round so that it fits into that round hole. So that flexibility is extremely important. Next slide, please. So in terms of criteria, I think we have limited time. So let me just very quickly state that in terms of criteria in this proposal document, we try to look at local and context-specific issues apart from the typical operational and business due diligence questions. So in a sense, we looked at certain ESG markers on climate, environment, social aspects, to ensure that the four to five SDGs that this facility was targeting, that they could be achieved. And also to identify certain safeguard parameters. Ultimately, it's a financing, right? You need to safeguard the financing. So identifying certain safeguard parameters to the criteria as much as possible to ensure that governance and all those criteria are also addressed. In terms of projects, for example, while the purpose was to look at solar, wind, etc., the idea was also to include decentralized clean energy solutions because that aligned closer to the vulnerable demographics we wanted the solution to target. So for instance, we kept it open for things like clean cook stove, battery rickshaws, or pedicabs, what we call in certain countries, microgrids, solar water pumps, solar devices, micro level financial institutions that in turn fund clean energy, and so on and so forth. Since some of the businesses might also be rural, we added things like clearance of land in the proper manner from the rural land authorities. Now, in countries like ours, in most developing countries, rural land processes are typically much more complex than urban land processes. All this also required us to understand Zimbabwe's clean energy situation a lot. Who were the players? How does it work, etc., and which then also helped to build an investee pipeline to show in the proposal. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm very happy to share that this particular blueprint proposal has been approved by the UN Joint SDG Fund for operationalization. So hopefully it should be rolling out very soon. One thing to add here is that it was only one of the only 5 proposals that were approved this year from amongst the many that were submitted to them. Next slide, please. So that was about Zimbabwe in Africa, but we feel that these sort of structures may be very useful to replicate in other vulnerable countries as well, including in Asia, where otherwise even the most optimistic of finance enthusiasts would normally feel averse to investing. So just leaving a food for thought for all of you on which Asian countries you feel may be in similar situations and would be able to benefit from replication of these sort of solutions. Next slide, please. So with this, thanks a lot for your patient listening. Do write into corporate@octasesg.com in case you have any questions or want to know more. And with this, over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Surajit. And so we've gone from hearing about ways that WBCSD is trying to scale up through working on corporate procurement and PPAs, to the rooftop PV model, to a model for scaling up finance to reach those in need, to have gender benefits, to have development benefits. And I have questions about the SDG impacts and the incentives for investors, which I'll ask later, Surajit. Still want to hear when we get to the discussion about the resilience and embedding resilience into these. But now we're going to go from Zimbabwe back out to Asia, to India, and we're going to hear from Nisha Menon, who's a chief consultant with DESL. And DESL has been active for a long time in India. It's one of the sort of venerable, storied firms working in energy efficiency for many years. Done a lot of really great work, and she's going to talk about a challenge that we've been dealing with the past couple of days at ASIF. In fact, yesterday we had a really interesting spotlight session on scaling up investments for SMEs, and the link between the SMEs and investors and the challenges in doing that. That was organized by a group that I'm part of called PFAN, the Private Financing Advisory Network. Sad to say, Nisha, we didn't solve the problem, but we did find out some interesting things in regards to SMEs about barriers to banks setting up green bonds. So the whole point of everything we need to do now is we need to do it 3, 4, 5 times faster. And so when I see a title like FinSec Solutions to help Indian SMEs reach carbon neutrality, my ears perk up. So Nisha, I look forward to your presentation, and thank you for joining us here at ASEF.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to confirm that my presentation is visible. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
There's no need to be disappointed, really, Peter. We've traveled quite a bit, from where we were and where we are now. So there is hope in the horizon, which is what my presentation is going to focus on. Now, for the benefit of the audience who are outside the subcontinent, a bit of context on why small and medium enterprises or SMEs are such an important subject in India. We have about 19.6 million industries in the micro, small, and medium category. SMEs in India are actually defined as micro, small, and medium, with a threshold defined either based on the investment in plant and machinery, and more recently it's been modified with an additional criteria based on turnover. So this number of 19.6 million is only those in the manufacturing sector and excludes the ones in the services sector. Now, the sector is very important because it provides employment to about 36 million people. In terms of gross value addition of SME, the share of SMEs in India in GDP is around 6%, that is around 150 to 160 million dollars in 2019. Half of the industrial exports occur from SMEs, which is valued at around 150 billion. In terms of geography, a specific characteristic of the SMEs is that which is probably not specific to India, is that it is located in clusters. Our estimate is that SMEs in India are distributed, it's a large country, are typically concentrated in about 400 geographic clusters. This, of course, excludes the artisanal clusters, of which I think there are estimates indicate there are over 2,000 artisanal clusters. So that brings to context by the size of the industries, and on an average, 94% of the total SMEs are in the micro category. I am not really sure what the specific number for manufacturing SMEs are, but it's probably in the same 90 to 94% of these 19.6 million is in the micro category. So this specific trait of geography and size has been the centerpiece for design of interventions to promote energy efficiency in SMEs. So they account for about 80 million tons of oil equivalent in terms of annual energy consumption. About 400, our estimates is around 400 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in GHG emissions. 54% of these emissions are from electricity, and a quarter of these estimates of these emissions are from coal usage. In addition to energy, we also estimate that around 2,600 million meter cube of water consumption is on account of the SMEs. Now, if we come to this debate on whether energy efficiency is almost mainstream, so there's quite a bit of work that has been happening in the context of, providing financing for energy efficiency interventions in MSMEs. We began with grants and subsidies which were provided. They still continue to be available to the SMEs in some of our states, but the amount is quite limited. Then there is debt financing. Conventional debt financing products were available, as far as I know, around 15 years ago, beginning with the project uptake of the State Bank of India. But for the last 11 years, they've been more or less mainstream. In the last 5 years or so, a few banks in the private sector and non-banking finance companies, or NBFCs, also have specific loan programs targeting energy efficiency and clean energy in SMEs. We also have credit and risk guarantee products for SMEs. There is favorable feedback in terms of the effectiveness and impacts of these loan programs that have run its course. And there's quite a bit of learnings which are being used in the design of new programs. Now, one element of coming to the relationship, I'll come to that later, yeah. So if you look at our experience, DSL's experience in the last 10 years, 2012 to 21, We were initially doing only energy audits in SMEs, but over a period of time, this is the offering has been energy audit linked with implementation support. So we've done energy audits and offered implementation support to over 1,000 SMEs. The identified potential for investment in energy efficiency is of the order of 2.5 billion Indian rupees. So there's there's a potential for almost a twofold increase in the opportunity when you bring into picture the opportunities for productivity improvement and cleaner production. So basically, there's a transition from energy efficiency to resource efficiency that we have seen in the last decade. Now, 80% of the SMEs that we have worked in have implemented some measures, okay, which is yet another evidence that energy efficiency is almost mainstream. The actual implementation may not be, all the recommendations are obviously not implemented, but almost a third of the recommendations tend to be implemented. Two types of investments are usually not contested: technology interventions and operational performance improvement. Not specifically in that order. It is a little bit more difficult to get them to agree to make design changes. Decision drivers are very factory specific, but there are some patterns that we have seen. So even though debt financing was not a particular mandate for any of these projects, we have developed an understanding of the decision-making process. More often than not, in most SMEs, decision is centralized around one person. So there's a lot of demand on that person's time. SMEs almost have a personal relationship with their lenders, and there's a high level of trust between them. Cost of financing, of course, is important, but it is not always a criteria. Among younger entrepreneurs, convenience of banking matters. And because of geography and because of trust, local presence of the SMEs, of the banks and the financial institutions also matter. Yet, we see that there are hurdles. From the perspective of the MSMEs, priority to energy efficiency that is accorded to implementing energy efficiency really depends upon the energy value addition, which is not uniform across the various manufacturing operations. For example, you may have a cut-to-pack garment unit where the energy value addition is not significant, or you can have a forging or a foundry unit where almost 40% of the manufacturing cost is on account of energy. Even the better organized MSMEs do not have a very structured credit strategy in terms of what is the right time to seek credit, what is the right amount, what is the optimum time that should be taken, etc. Access to credit for thin file industries and new to credit industries where there is no credit history is actually an issue. Mainstream banks, in fact, we've learned during the course that of various interventions that most of the banks and financial institutions spend quite a bit of resources in improving the financial literacy of the entrepreneurs. Yet, the estimated credit gap is as high as about $250 to $300 billion for the SMEs. Now, if you look at it from the lender's perspective, we've always had an issue in terms of appraising energy efficiency projects. There has been some progress in this, traceability of savings, and there has been some improvement, but still it remains a question mark. Turnaround time for loans, there's been a tremendous change in the last 4 or 5 years. We have promises of loans in 59 minutes or 49 minutes, but the best banks actually go from processing to dispersal in about a week nowadays. Now, financial institutions and banks with specific energy efficiency programs, they may not have the geographical access or the relationship with the SMEs. So that sometimes constrains the offtake of loans. Now, on the other hand, if you see that there are drivers too. The productivity gap between a micro and a small or medium enterprise is about 2x. Energy prices with more visibility to air quality related issues in many of the SME sectors, there is a compulsion to adopt cleaner fuels, and there is a technology cost associated with it. SEBI has this business responsibility and sustainable reporting which makes it incumbent on about 1,000 listed companies to improve their supply chain. There is awareness. Awareness has increased significantly. Benefits of digitalization has been realized, and these are throwing up inefficiencies in real time. Now, at the same time, we've seen quite a bit of developments in digital lending to MSMEs. Digital lending fintech is about the fastest growing in the world in India, estimated at around 110 billion in 2019 pre-COVID, and the growth rate they say is about 33% plus. The big advantage we get is that it removes human barriers from the assessment systems, and there is a flexibility to offer customized products based on cash flow patterns. So you're using objective data points such as cash flows and tax returns. You're able to track the loan journey of the enterprise, which you're able to map it on real time, based on which you're able to have a customized product. So you're able to do the risk categorization of the enterprise very objectively, overcome issues related to navigating the documentation process. The geography is no longer relevant, and we are also able to overcome language barriers. So on an overall basis, there is an improvement in financial inclusion, particularly from the informal sector of the SMEs. There are quite a number of lending models have been developed: flow-based, vertical-based, ecosystem-based, etc. And there's quite a bit of scope to nurture a symbiotic relationship between conventional lenders and digital NBFCs. So the ecosystem of banks working with fintech companies is growing. So moving forward, I would think that fintech is probably the only potential solution that we have in the horizon which can actually make non-recourse lending a reality. The fintech startups, they have contributed more to achieving financial inclusion than the traditional banking system has managed. So with the right drivers, I think probably we are looking at a future, an exciting future where we see much higher uptake of energy efficiency among MSMEs thanks to the fintech solutions. Thank you, Peter.
Great, and thank you, Nisha. And now we're going to go into panel. So we've got a panel view. We'll all go onto the stage, virtual stage together. I have a few observations because we were, covered a lot of ground. And, I think what's interesting about this session is that it sort of tethers together opportunities for scaling up financing and making progress faster. And I have some questions about actually, how resilient are these solutions as you scale up? I think it's fairly evident if we just go through the presentations first, the rescale and the battery consortia that WBCSD is putting together are promoting quicker and faster access to financing for corporates. So that's going to make finance flow faster into things like the supply chain. Energy storage is, de facto a resilient technology because it helps make distributed energy systems more viable because of it can help to complement the variable renewable energy. Then if we move on to the rooftop PV that Dana was talking about, clearly a decentralized system with a lot of rooftop PV is more resilient than a centralized system with 2 or 3 big generators. And then if we look at the SDG fund, which I have questions about Surajit, but that's a really great example of a fund that could be the type of fund that could be utilized across Asia. And finally, I'd like to get a 59-minute loan or even a 1 hour and 59-minute loan. But it's interesting, you ended up by saying fintech is the solution because Meton and people, I've known Meton for, 15 years, but we've been in the trenches for 30 years on energy efficiency, slogging away, trying to get people to pay attention. And I do agree with you that that being able to have non-recourse lending for these micro companies is super interesting. And one thing that really stuck out, Nisha, was the productivity gap of twofold between micro SMEs and SMEs. So with that, I'll hold my questions for you guys because I want to let the panelists in and get a word in. So Mitan, you've worked, as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, I won't say actually how many years, I don't want to embarrass you, but you've worked a long time on energy efficiency, on demand side management. You started companies, you sold companies. We worked together on the precursor to Clean Power Asia, which was called Eco Asia, on lighting solutions. And here you are working with ADB to develop a regulatory roadmap for more efficient and affordable street lighting in Vietnam. So can you tell us a little bit about that and just some of the issues around designing it and getting it financed, and you know, and what makes the street lighting systems, you know, more resilient? The last time I was working together with you, we were promoting CFLs, and we were like, okay, LEDs will come along someday, and LEDs have really accelerated. And probably some of the systems you're looking at have renewable backup or renewable primary supply. So tell us a little bit about the street lighting work and your thoughts on financing this as a resilience, as part of a resilient package of resilient infrastructure solutions.
Sure, Peter, and hi everybody. It's really nice to be on this panel. And actually, I was very excited to hear that energy efficiency is almost there, and it's just presentation. So it's been, you know, it's been so long, but we're still, you know, moving forward. So I think that's pretty nice. It's and I guess, you know, Peter, you packed in a lot of questions and issues in your questions to us at the panel, and so I'll try to address as many as I can. So I think, you know, financing and public infrastructure are really complicated endeavors. And, you know, at the most basic level, if we're talking about resiliency, you know, that means you adding factors, you adding equipment, you adding design. And basically what that means is you're adding cost, both capital, you know, and OpEx. So then what happens is then, you know, you're going to end up with extending payback time, right? Or you lowering up the project's bankability, because right now resiliency is not counted or monetized as a direct benefit. So, and then the, you know, one of the other challenges, well, you know, localized challenge that we're working with now in Vietnam is that, you know, public financing in Vietnam is very challenging because energy performance contract is not part of the regulatory structure. So one of the, you know, one of the key activity by ADB in Vietnam right now as part of this roadmap is to actually introduce support for in government the regulatory structure for energy performance contracting, because there's you know, up to this point it's just been loans, and now the government is reaching you know, the cap for the loan amounts, and then so now there has to be other financing mechanisms to support some of these public infrastructure work. Now that's about as much as I can cover, because you know, I'm mostly a technical guy, so I'll cover more on the technical issues as well. So first, you know, designing for resiliency is currently not part of the current practice, right? So there's not a how-to manual on how it should be done, or even a clear definition of what is a resilient system. And specific to what the work that I do, there's not really a clear definition of what is a resilient street lighting or, you know, public building. So right now, what we're trying to do is just to increase awareness, you know, and build capacity, because again, the planning process is the challenge. It's, you know, it's not something that's currently in the awareness of most municipalities. You know, we have to increase the awareness. We have to build a capacity, And so the first step is to, so the expand the planning process to include additional considerations such as vulnerability of the population, the particular geographic and climatic challenge for that area that we're working in. A lot of Vietnam, large cities are on the coast, and it's one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. And there's always storms, the threats of increased storms and other things that happens with climate change. So we're looking at coming down in the planning process to very basic things, vulnerable areas, potential evacuation routes, and what we can do from sort of a public services, public lighting perspective, because that's what we're designing for. My focus has been on street lighting. So now we're currently designing for just energy efficiency at the municipal level, and that's already challenging enough to get financing. So we're just trying to increase technical awareness of the types of technologies available, and how to maximize energy efficiency in the public sector. So we're not really capable of addressing how to make communities more resilient. So at the most basic, right? So we're replacing, like you said, Peter, we're replacing all technologies with LEDs. So give us about 40–50% more energy operating efficiency, and like 90 or so more maintenance percent more in maintenance reduction. So from that perspective, so we're still doing more adaptation than mitigation than adaptation. Now, so
well, that was going to be, if I could just dive in. You answered the question I was going to ask. Is like, fine, you're not Mr. Resilient, but you're Mr. Lighting, and the lighting you're putting in is much better than it might be otherwise. And you mentioned like this whole thing about CFLs, right? We for the historical record, we developed something called the Asia Lighting Compact, and we were setting standard for CFLs, and we knew that LEDs lasted like, what is it? 10 times longer, 5 times longer, but they weren't ready yet. And now they are ready, and the systems you're putting in, I'm assuming, or designing for. So 40–50% increase in operating efficiency and 90% reduction in maintenance. So my question is, in terms of the awareness of the benefits of that resilience, because before we used to say, oh, if you do a life cycle costing of it, it's better, but no one would do life cycle costing. So now, how do you sort of make that case? It seems like obvious and self-evident. Are you putting regulations in place to require this, or is it better just to sort of make it sort of obvious from a financial sense that, oh, well, I want to be like that municipality because these systems are so much better than mine? Like, how do you sort of get that spread across the Vietnamese municipalities and then other countries?
Right. So then now it comes to the second part of your question. I mean, your second question. What have we learned about resilient street lighting? And we've learned that it is possible, right? One of the key technological advances with LEDs is that you marry energy efficient lighting technology with the advanced mobile technology, right? So now you can track real time the status of each light point. In the network, you can actually assess the network after such like a storm event, for example. You can actually know what part of the network is operating and which is not, which is something that's not possible to do before. Now, the other part that we've been trying to add to this just the energy efficient lighting is additional services. So, you have traffic cams, you have environmental sensors, you have other sort of, I guess, smart sensors that can be added to the network. And so it becomes, like a smart, and you sell it to the municipality as the smart system, right? So you're providing additional municipal services, and that makes the system more attractive it's not necessarily more resilient per se, but it's more, it provides a little bit more function, and it's more justifiable, and it can be, I don't know the repurpose is the right word, but you can, you know, you can, if there's such an you know, climate storm or whatever, an event, you can actually have the system, you can, you know, repurpose the system to service to provide the services that you need. You can turn the lights on along the evacuation routes, for example, or, you know, or you can, you know, you make sure that the evacuation routes have lights that have sensors, so that you can, you know if they're actually their operational status after storm, so whether or not they're working, and if they are, and if you need to evacuate the population, you can turn the lights on. So, you know, there are things that you can do to help with resiliency. The system itself is not completely robust because, you know, again, if you specify lights that will survive 150 miles an hour wind, for example, again, things become more expensive. But you can add to the system and convince or you know, offer it to the municipalities as a package of additional service. Yeah. And oh, by the way, it actually might come in handy during, you know, during a climate event, and that becomes a more appealing package that they are willing to finance. Yeah. They're willing to buy and install.
One final quick question, then we'll move on.
Okay.
Are these systems more expensive, harder to sell? Like, what is the experience in trying to, it all sounds good and it is smart, and it's also sexy, which has been a problem on energy efficiency. It's not sexy. Right. So smart systems sound sexier than, you know, like energy efficient pumps or something.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it is actually easier to solve because, you know, part of it is you know, ASEAN is promoting the smart city as the new model now. So there's you know, providing more municipal services with AI and you know, IoT. So that becomes and actually a lot of governments, including the Vietnamese government, are sort of pushing the municipalities towards planning for the smart city, and so this increased lighting technology package is sellable to the municipalities as part of the smart technology package. So it is more sexy, you know, and oh, by the way, we're getting some energy efficiency with it too.
Yeah, so well, I'm gonna recognize that. Thank you. I recognize there's a question from Fida Hussein in Pakistan about, you know, can member countries get attractive proposals that are developed and submitted to get access to finance, or are they just and practically implemented, or are they just going to political figures for their own benefits? I'm not going to ask any of you on the panel to answer that question, but you know, I think in the context of making smart projects attractive, what you did a really good job of describing that. I'm going to share one thing, and then we'll go to Viet. I have to share this because yesterday, Charlotte Wang, who is with eQuota, you may have met her at a previous ASEF. She said something very interesting. She said, the young generation don't want to go into the field, so we have to work on digitalizing things. And I was thinking about sitting with your smartphone and like managing the street lighting infrastructure around your city, and you don't actually have to, you know, go do anything. You're just managing it. Very fascinating overview on street lighting as an example of a controllable and smart infrastructure. So Viet, we'll come back to you on some of these things. Mitan, thank you very much. So Viet, you work for the German government in development cooperation, supporting scaling up investments in the private sector in developing and emerging economies. Could you give us, you know, you've heard a lot, interested definitely in your thoughts about the challenges we've been hearing. But first, maybe you could just describe where the German government is providing technical assistance and financial support for climate and clean energy across Asia? I imagine it's almost everywhere in Asia, but maybe you could just talk about that. And then just to relate it to this conversation, if you could describe the guidelines or guidance that you provide or in your regulations to require that the loans and grants that you make are for infrastructure that is more likely to be around longer, that is more resilient for society and also more inclusive. So Viet, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and also distinguished guests and dear panelists. Thank you for your inspiring information. I really learned a lot today. I found all the different ideas that you presented today really inspiring, and maybe later on also we could catch up. That would be for me quite.
Yeah, we'll have a beer. We'll have a beer in the networking room. There's a new app. You have to go on the Apple Store and buy it. You can actually physically drink beer from it.
Let's try that, or maybe let's meet next time or next year in Manila. Personally, it would also be of preference, at least for myself. But thank you, Peter. Thank you for the presentation and for the introduction. My name is Viet Schick. I'm the energy expert here at the Agency for Business and Economic Development. Peter, you mentioned German Development Cooperation. Maybe let me give you a brief oversight of who we actually represent here as agency. The German Development Cooperation is managed by our ministry, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. In German, you call it BMZ. And BMZ has different so-called executing agencies. I think you know them as well. One of them is GIZ, the other one is KfW Development Bank, and we have another development finance institution, which is called KfW DEG. The latter and the first, that is DEG and GIZ, we are combined here in the Agency for Business and Economic Development. And our task is actually to support companies from the private sector that want to engage and invest in developing countries. So that is our task. We advise, we inform, and we do networking with, for example, projects of technical assistance, mostly GIZ, because that's where we come from, where we have a good network, and where we can connect companies and project managers of GIZ quite quickly. DEG is a development finance institution that finances companies, provides funds, and provides loans as well as equity. And that is dedicated to companies, and companies either from Germany, but more and more also companies from developing countries, by, for example, project finance, which is relevant, of course, for renewable energy projects, and also by corporate loans. So you also asked the questions, where are we operating? That is actually in quite a lot of developing countries. You mentioned it. Now you have to differ a bit because our ministry changed its strategy a bit. There are some countries where there's the so-called bilateral cooperation has been reduced, and but still the branch that I am coming from, which is cooperation with the private sector, is still operating in all OECD development assistance companies. That is all countries that are listed on the DAC list. So yeah, did I answer all the questions, Peter?
Well,
or?
let's go to, yeah. So let's go and let me just sort of give an example. So I used to be the senior climate change advisor, okay, and then I got terminated by Trump, not by tweet, but by Trump, because he cut the budgets right in 2017 when he came in. And all the regulations that had been in place to make sure that US government assistance met certain climate criteria were slow walked, at least for a while. Now they're back. And so my question is, what are the particular types of resiliency guardrails that you have in your assistance, or the directives you have to sort of make sure you're supporting investing if it's DEG, or providing grants if it's GIZ, in smarter, as Niton said, for the street lighting, or more resilient in terms of distributed energy, as Dana talked about, that you're focusing on these sorts of activities as the end result of your investment.
Okay. Well, luckily we did not have. We had a government change in Germany as well. Now we had a quite interesting shift, because our former Minister of Environment is now our Minister of Development Cooperation. So that is the mindset concerning climate change, adaptation, mitigation, but also resilience is of course in her DNA. And now she is putting that through the whole system and through the whole ministry, and of course all the executive agencies. What we do is, and now I would like to take maybe an approach through the lens of a banker, because if a development finance institute shells out a loan, of course the bank would like that the loan is being repaid. So that's, in effect, is for me at least some kind of a resilience. You can now maybe have different definitions of resilience, but I thought about it, and I think resilience to me is that you have a business model which is sustainable to certain influences, either internal but also external influences that have a certain impact on your business model. And either you can sustain because you have certain, I would say, you did your so-called due diligence, and you know what to do when a certain shock or a certain impact arrives, or you can be flexible and adapt your business model to a certain shock. We in Germany, we in Europe, we are quite, unfortunately, we have quite a lot of shocks currently through the Russian war on Ukraine. So we have to adapt, and we can see now also for our personal policy here in Germany, what that has meant if you are not resilient. And luckily we have seen that in our project portfolios. We do different due diligence checks. We do different pre-feasibility studies before either going into a project concerning technical assistance, that is supporting policy guidance through a government, or in the case of DEG, when it comes to banking loans. There's also, for example, a promotion program by DEG where they support their business partners exactly in doing that. That is being more resilient and being more flexible when it comes to these kinds of shocks on their business model.
Yeah,
sure. Two more points, because for example, when it comes to different resilience, climate change, for example, DEG and WWF partnered to create a so-called water risk filter, also to see what is the impact of missing water, of climate change on certain water resources. Not only interesting for agriculture, but of course also for power plants. If you have currently fossil fuel power plants, which needs water for cooling, for example, or hydropower plants, if you do not have water, your business model is not working anymore.
This is called the water risk
filter. Yeah.
Filter. So it's like a filter in terms of looking at policy or investment.
That is right, yeah. Right. Certain impacts and what you can do. And also we have, and that has been done through GIZ colleagues and cooperation with another consultancy. We are training so-called climate experts. And these experts actually go into different companies and do different assessments with companies to see, okay, are they resilient concerning not only mitigation, but also adaptation. Climate experts is the program that I have mentioned.
Yeah, okay. Okay, do you have anything else?
Maybe one last, you can see that maybe here, that's the so-called Develop program, which is a promotional program by the German Development Corporation, where a company can also apply. There has been currently not a really, I would like to take maybe one example from the agricultural sector when it comes to supply chains, also resilience, how people can react when, and the companies can react to have more sustainable supply chains. Also one part of resilience.
Great. Well, we'll stop there and we'll move on. Thank you so much. That was fantastic, Varric. And I really like the water risk filter. But you know, right before that, in your comments about being a banker, and if something has a return, of course, something has a return until it doesn't have a return. So like the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines had a great return until they didn't have a return, and you're sort of screwed. And that was like a big catastrophic failure in German policy, which your premier Olaf Scholz has done an incredible job. And the I don't know if you call it the parliament, done an amazing job of changing direction in policy. Really impressive. But, you know, this gets to the point. Meton made a couple of really interesting points about, you know, when you design something to be resilient, you're adding design cost, you're adding equipment cost, and you're lowering the ROI because you can't generally monetize the resilience. You know, unless you have a longer view, or unless you have experience in the sector and you know that, or unless people help, like climate experts from the German government help you figure that out. I want to go back and just get some, I do want to, I think, focus on the audience now, because we have some questions. I want to go through them fairly quickly, because there may be some other things we want to talk about, but there's some good questions. There was this question from Fida Hussain from Pakistan about attractive proposals being developed and submitted. You know, these are for clean energy infrastructure projects to get access to financing, but practically these funds are utilized through political figures for their own political benefits. I think that's more of a comment. That's probably true in a lot of cases. You know, I don't know, maybe Meton, you could comment on, you know, or maybe I'll bring Dana back in. If you can comment on the challenges in areas where you know there may be corruption, or there may be other things besides just cost benefit that are affecting the decisions, and how you make the case, you know, for you know, a project or an investment that is overall beneficial, you know, based on the merits. And some of those, you know, Meton mentioned a number of the benefits. So how do you make that case, you know, recognizing that you can't always control, you know, who is in charge politically and what sort of deals there are? How do you make that case, Dana? Any thoughts on that?
No, I do have some thoughts on it. Let me just say a couple of things. You know, there are some differences between funds that are either managed by political institutions or funded by donors, and a lot of what we did was facilitating private investment. So they operate differently, but there are political issues with both. I have observed there's, you know, a large fund in Thailand, which you're familiar with, that funds energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And I think, you know, the people who are involved in that are doing a great job. But you always have political ambitions, but to look at things that will really inform decisions in the future. But in terms of policies, it's going to drive decisions of the private sector, including utilities and non-utilities. Political issues do become important. You know, I won't comment on what I think the political issues might be in Thailand, because I wouldn't say that I'm the most informed about it in terms of what could be the real barriers. but I will say that our hunch is based on the qualitative work we did. Well, the quantitative work showed that all of the stakeholders' concerns could be addressed. But there obviously are things that, you know, we were told informally by people who are trying to balance the consumer's desire for lower prices and more choice with the current structure, how the utility regulatory environment is structured. And there are disincentives throughout the system. So one way to take the politics out is to get rid of the disincentives along the way. But sometimes that means big changes. So I think, you know, but it's never going to be just about cost benefit that can answer certain questions that are overtly expressed. And one thing that we have done in many projects throughout the world, not as much in energy projects, but in some, one in, I'm trying to think if it was Jordan or another country, is political economy analysis, where you really look at who's influencing the decisions and who can, first and second tier people who can influence decisions from a political standpoint. And I think that's really valuable. So that's my short answer. And if there's, I know that you had several questions earlier, so you can bring those up.
You know, that's a really tough question, Fida. Thank you for making us uncomfortable trying to answer that question. But you know, seriously though, you know, I think the Energy Conservation Fund in Thailand has been incredible. It's based on a tax on oil products, and it's funded, you know, 40 to $80 million. 40 to I'm trying to remember, 1.5 billion divided by 30. Yeah, it's like several $1 billion a year sorry, 40 to $60 million a year of investments. Okay, so that, you know, the main thing, interesting thing about that is it's never been killed, right? Because it basically, you could reduce cost for oil by getting rid of that tax, but that tax, and sure, it's been used for different purposes, but almost all of it has gone to energy efficiency and renewable energy. So with that, we'll move on, and that's a good thing. So you know, as far as Fida's question about, you know, I think that we need, you know, we're in the middle of a transition, and the tenor of the talks yesterday, or 2 days ago from the keynote, we are changing the energy system. We are changing. That's a social change. That's a legal change. That's you know, it's a change in business, and it's very hard to do that without a lot of dislocation. So a lot of people are threatened, including utilities. And I'll just say, you know, briefly that, you know, an issue that ADB studied in terms of Thailand and the problem of the solar rooftop reducing utility revenues was to set you know, basically say, if you connect to the grid and feed in, then you have to pay a charge of using the grid as a battery. Now that's a wonderful policy to, you know, because then that's fair. You're using the grid as a battery for your solar rooftop. Well, they haven't agreed on that. But that's an example of a policy that, you know, over time could get adopted if people think it makes sense. So let's try to go through this a little bit faster. I'll see who wants to take this, and we'll try to answer each question in like a minute or a minute and a half so we can get through them. Ashim Roy asks, what should a strategy be to mobilize funds for special renewable energy investment? Should we create a new fund? Or should we build on existing funds and tweak them? Any suggestions on that from experience? Feel free to raise your hand. Maybe not you, Dana, because you just spoke, but maybe we can see if Surajit, do you have a view on that, Surajit, in terms of, say you're a country and you know, is it better to start something new where you can set the rules, or maybe channel funding through existing funding mechanisms?
Thanks, Peter. So this really depends on context to context. So there's no one formula, right? So, I mean, the baseline, even within developing countries, you were talking about Thailand. Thailand is at a very different place from India, and India is a very different place from most of sub-Saharan African countries. So it really depends what the local financial infrastructure is like. If the local financial infrastructure has an opportunity to utilize an existing scheme or fund, or some portion of the existing system can be leveraged, then obviously that adds more effectiveness and efficiency to the entire thing. It helps in faster results than setting something new. And when I say setting something new, we need to remember that these sort of alternate financing mechanisms, it's as much about people management as it is about the product or the the project. I remember at least 75% of our time on the Zimbabwe project, while we were sitting here in India, we had almost engagement of 4 to 5 months, and 75% was all about people management, of trying to convince and make people on the same alignment that why we are trying to do this, why so and so solution needs to be done. And that discussion also included this bit of, do we use an existing thing, do we create something new? In countries, vulnerable countries where financial systems are precarious and not very well sophisticated, it's always useful to use something existing. But then it really depends what is that solution. So there are, if you build on something that is already fractured, then the end result will also be fractured. So it really depends on.
Okay. Well,
one answer.
Let's leave it at that. It was unfair of me to ask you to answer that question in a minute, since you took 6 months to talk about just the people part of setting up your fund. The problem is everyone's getting flipped out because we've only got 10 years till the planet fries if we don't, and everyone is saying things like, we need to move faster and we can't waste time. But anything you do, like setting up your fund or setting up another fund after your fund, it takes time. So it's a bit stressful, I think, on all of us. So I think, one of the best things we can do is look for solutions like that are systemic, like the PPA work, the rescale work that WBCSD is doing, like taking solutions like for smart street lighting that Meton and ADB may be developing, and really work together with partners across countries. Take your Zimbabwe fund, the REF, right? And I think that's sort of a way to be resilient, is to do things faster and smarter. Faster doesn't necessarily mean resilient, but you take those things that are resilient and make them faster and smarter. We have a question here from, that was Ashim Roy. We have a question from Ashari Ali. And this question is, let's see, there's 2 questions here. It's the same question, I guess. How do we leverage the abundance of nature-based feedstock for biofuel in Indonesia? Biofuel can complement the transition of fossil energy to renewables. Most funding is focused on solar and other sexy options. There's that word sexy. Things have to be sexy to be sort of politically salient and important. The technology for drop-in biofuel is available, but funding is challenging. That's a tough one, because there's many aspects to that. First is, shouldn't we spend more on our biomass resources and use some of the biomass to create biofuel instead of just focusing on solar and wind, because we need fuels? That's part of it. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Don't all jump at once. We also have food versus fuel options. Thailand's pretty advanced in biofuels. They are, all the pumps have, E20, E80, B7, for biodiesel. Any thoughts there? Let me put somebody on the spot. Who wants to be put on the spot? Let's see.
Peter,
yes, Derek, please go ahead.
Please. I have a certain bias to that, because using biomass as biofuels is not really something that is, first of all, supported also by our ministry. There are certain restrictions. There's also always a conflict concerning food via fuel. I would rather say try to use those resources that are generated by organic waste and try to use that first. That is my point.
So in other words, like organic waste, anaerobic digestion, and basically
Yes.
biogas or something like that, or composting, or say cattle manure or things like that. So more biogas than liquid biofuels.
Yes, absolutely. That is my preference. I know there's a certain market for biofuels. Nowadays also with green hydrogen idea is coming up, PTL, e-fuels, and so on and so forth, but that is a totally different aspect. So I think, and maybe coming back to resilience, because now you mentioned compost, for example, we have to do something also to work on our, I do not know the word in English now, and it's actually the earth where we grow our produce on. We have to take care on that, so that we have also a resilient base where to grow our crop on, and to use that crop then to put it in our tank. That is something that is not really supported by our ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the defense of the Thai policymakers, they've been fairly thoughtful, and they have pretty aggressive targets. But it's part of, well, I don't know if it's part of an integrated agricultural strategy overall, but they do pay attention to how much, arable land and what crops are being eaten, what crops are being exported. And that's not to say it's without conflict. It's a great question. Sorry, we don't have a
Peter, please can I very quickly add a follow-up point on what Viet said and on this question of Ashari Ali. Since he's mentioned Indonesia, so I'm just taking some cue from 3 projects I've done on sustainable palm oil. And in ethanol, for example, one of the main biofuels, there is a lot of countries blend palm oil into that. There's a blending that's often done in case of biofuels like ethanol with palm oil. Now, palm oil cultivation itself brings a lot of climate-related, deforestation-related risks to Indonesia, Malaysia, even Thailand for that matter. So there's a need to look beyond the headlines and see that while, yes, biofuels per se can be a good solution, will that solution lead to new problems? So in the attempt to solve existing problems, are we then expanding new problems? And then all these, for example, we just saw that recently palm oil, all the crunch that happened in the market, we saw how prices, export bans, all these things happen. So there are, one has to look through those nitty-gritties as well.
Well, yes, and I think in Thailand and there's a lot of bio waste that's used for biomass, for burning, in factories, and some of that's used for biofuels. And I think if you asked policymakers, it's, they're conscious of that. But these trade-offs are important. Jake Toole makes a comment that biofuels may not be sustainable given that they will compete with food supply. Well, I think that's why it's important to sort of make sure that that is not happening and that the biofuels you're using are not driving that out. Let's see, we have another question from Jake Toole on, do we have any suggestions on how lenders and investors can quickly provide funding for energy efficiency developers like ESCOs or energy service companies in developing countries like the Philippines so they can hasten development of energy efficiency projects? We have 6 minutes left. Miton, I'm gonna ask you because you're an old energy efficiency bozo. You've been around for a while and you're probably well placed to try to answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does come back to what we were talking before, is that the only way that you're going to get more funding is you have to develop attractive projects, and that's, that's what bankers know. If you come to them with something that's not, again, back to lack of a better word, sexy, it's not going to receive funding. Yes, I think there's definitely government policies that will direct more more available funding to green loans and things like that. So there's from that perspective. But again, we've learned enough. I mean, I guess the good news is that we've been around. There's more of us now, and there's plenty of us that have learned how to develop good, attractive projects and things that will sell. And I think that it's not about more loan, but more projects. I think more project development, right? So it feeds into that.
Yeah, and I have two comments on that. I agree with you completely that we need more projects. So one comment on that is a lot of the ESCOs, including some that I know in the Philippines, need money to do the detailed energy audits so they can get the, investment grade audits so they can get the financing. And that's a big barrier, right? So they come to us at PFAN, Private Financing Advisory Network, and say, oh, can you fund this pre-feasibility study? And we actually don't have funding for that. We rely on the developers. So they're sort of a bit stuck. The other thing is in the spotlight session that I mentioned yesterday on developing, helping SMEs get access to financing, this came up, this issue about energy efficiency and the fact that, we need some sort of guarantee facilities, and the SIDBI from India talked about that, right? And the default rate on energy efficiency loans is actually very low, right? So a combination of having good projects, having more guarantee facilities so you can put money in a fund. Thailand has actually done this, and you could fund more projects with a guarantee to help because they don't have non-recourse financing. I'm sorry, Nisha, I should let you comment on this based on your experience in India, just quickly, and then maybe we'll have time for one more question. Suggestions on, how lenders and investors, can get involved in funding energy efficiency developers to help develop projects, because usually they're waiting for the project. And as Nitan said, the projects aren't coming, or there aren't enough of good projects coming fast enough.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. The thing about attractive projects is that in a very price-sensitive market, you have the ESCO value proposition has to be very clear. Now, what is going to prevent the host facility from doing the project by themselves, by accessing financing that is available? Money is available, right? So what is going to stop them? If the project is so attractive, what is going to stop them? So the value proposition for an ESCO project has to be very clear. That is what we have learned from 20 years trying to do ESCO projects in India. There is going to be, when you bring in an ESCO, there is going to be an increase in the cost, overall cost of the project. Depending upon the type, it could be anything from 10 to 15 to 20%. And is the value proposition attractive enough to take it to the project host? Now, the answer probably is very country specific. It depends upon the type of project. Say it has to be attractive, and also the markets. For us, the big question is: are the contracts enforceable? Do I have a cash flow guarantee? Okay, that is the barrier. It is not really, the lenders don't have a problem. If you have a good ecosystem for enforcement of contracts and guaranteeing a cash flow, projects would happen. So that would be my short response.
Okay. Well, look, we got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to
one
summarize.
last thing, Peter, and
Sorry,
the elephant in the room is still low energy prices. I mean, we've seen energy price going up, so I think now is the time to get more projects in, because now they're looking more attractive. But
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. We should start more wars and force the price up. And no, it's always a double-edged sword. It's like the price goes up, and then, that feeds the war machine and the negative impacts of that. But the fact is, I think the Europeans have had it more correctly than the Americans, who are really afraid of high prices, probably because Americans have to drive further and it's more expensive, like just the cost of, whereas Europe has a higher energy prices, higher taxes, but they've got a much better public transit system for people to move around. So I'm going to summarize, and I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to go through all of you and just ask you if you feel more resilient or not after this session. So just to summarize, Serbi talked about some really interesting work that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is doing called Rescale, and they're working on PPAs and standardizing those and making those sort of able to be entered into as more of a sort of a standard process, attract investment faster, get projects in place faster. She also talked about a really interesting consortium in India, and I hope you have plans to make this, expand this sorts of activity across other countries in Asia, working on storage, because that's going to really be a next frontier, is really solar and storage, wind and storage. We heard Dana talk about the work that APT did with USAID through the Clean Power Asia program on rooftop PV. We all know that this has been going on around the region. I think it maybe is not as well known, the spectacular success that Viet Nam has had, and then some of the analysis that went into that and some of the differences between Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. But huge potential in rooftop PV if some of the sort of technical and then utility financing issues can be solved. We heard about this exciting renewable energy financing facility that Sorajit's group, Octus ESG, is doing with support from the UN SDG fund. That's a $45 million fund that became operational last month. It's a good example for us to look at in Asia. And we heard about from Nisha about how fintech can be a way to more efficiently help micro and SMEs get access to non-recourse financing more quickly. Then we had a really good discussion, and thank you, Mitan, for staying up till 3 in the morning now to tell us about some of the aspects of street lighting as an infrastructure that needs to be financed, that has a lot of important public safety and security benefits, and making these systems more resilient, some of the benefits, making them smarter, and some of the benefits from smarter systems and additional types of value that these systems add. So thank you for sharing that. And Varric, also thank you for sharing your thoughts on what the German government is doing and the importance of putting in place strategies for making better informed investment decisions. And I really like the idea of the water risk filter as just sort of a systemic programmatic way of helping countries look at ways of developing water and risks associated with that. And you mentioned sort of the power sector as one example, which needs lots of water for thermal plants. And that's between DEG and WWF. So with that, we're 3 minutes over. I would like to thank all of you, Serbi, Dana, Sorajit, Nisha, Mitan, and Varric, and thank the organizers of ASEF for creating a platform where we can have this sort of discussion, and hopefully the 3,000 or odd people of, they're not 3,000 odd people, there are about 3,000 registered participants this week, and they're not all odd. I did not mean that. But the folks who are watching this today were able to enjoy it. Please share this in your social media channels, because not everybody can watch this in real time, but the recordings will be available afterwards. And so I will ask you quickly, Serbi, do you feel more resilient or less resilient after this session?
No, it was very informative. And I think the way I feel more resilient is mainly because you bring along every part of the different, the entire chain that is involved for climate resiliency. So finance, in this case, finance, governments, corporates, in our panel as well. So I think that's one big takeaway.
Right. If all these people can talk to each other, it will be a good thing. But the discussion today was great. Dana, are you feeling more resilient?
I am feeling more resilient, and I think the way of tying together a lot of the analysis-based work that we've done with the broader issues that are brought up by people who really understand projects is that there are ways of understanding and putting numbers to the value of resilience. And I think it's important to think about that. I'm sure there are people who have, and let's do it, because it's an economic question. It's a public policy question as much as it is a financing question of how do you have the right enabling environment.
Right. So that's a key takeaway, is just the monetization and the economic arguments. Just quickly, Surajit, more resilient?
Absolutely. Excellent session. Thank you, Peter. And maybe I'll just take a cue from the last thing that Dana spoke. Let's do it. That, there is no perfect solution. There is no perfect match. All solutions at the end will be at some intersection, right? Mitigation, adaptation, resilience, whatever it is. I think the key now is, like you said, 10 years to get fried. Let's do it. Let's put this into action.
That's good. We won't get into a trademark problem with Nike we'll just say let's do it instead of just do it. Thank you for that, Dana, and thank you, Surajit. Nisha, you feeling more resilient?
For sure, for sure. You've been talking at length about the length of experience you've had doing with energy efficiency. The only thing that's been keeping us going is the fact that we are resilient and we're always innovating and looking at ways to, make sure that this stays important and a very important item in the agenda for businesses. Thank you.
Well, frankly, energy efficiency is never the most important thing at ASIF, and that's always a bone of contention. But you work for one of the icons, Data Roy. So give him my regards. And Mitan, more resilient?
Yes, I really like I appreciate the fact of being on the panel. I always come away from ASIF feeling more energized. So thank you, Peter, for keeping this going. And hopefully I can maintain the momentum until next year.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you in person next year in Manila. I'm thinking that's the way it's going, but it's ADB's decision, of course. And Varick, feeling more resilient after today's conversation?
Of course, totally. Thank you for the great moderation. And I think the resilience is also about sharing knowledge and to know that there are other persons who are also fighting for the same solutions, and to know and to have learned also from your really valuable contributions and activities that you are doing here in the panel. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And I think also now it's time to act.
Yeah, let's act. Let's do it. Okay, thank you so much and have a great day. Yeah.